Hello, everyone, and thank you for taking time out of your Tuesday to join us. My name is Michael Brennan, and I'm a Senior Program Officer with the Technology and Society team at Ford Foundation. One of the parts of our grant making that I oversee is the strategy focused on digital infrastructure of the internet. A key piece of this infrastructure are the standards and protocols that dictate how the internet works and the governance bodies and systems that create them. Today, we're going to hear from a leading researcher on why and how this infrastructure is a critical human rights issue, and then have a conversation between two thoughtful activists about how we can better understand and address the implications of it. Niels ten Oever is an influential researcher and activist in this field. Niels has spent years advocating for the public interest and human rights in the places where technical decisions that govern the internet are made. He developed Article 19's Team Digital, a leading voice in representing this same mission. And he's been an important partner and grantee. In fact, I credit Niels with a central role in helping Ford Foundation understand how internet governance is, in fact, a critical social justice issue, and one which we must focus on if we are to achieve our mission of fighting the drivers of inequality. I hope that through our talk and Q&A today, you will also come to see it this way, and perhaps think in a new way about how you, your organization, or your networks might engage in this area of work. Niels has just published a report on this topic called Human Rights Are Not a Bug, Upgrading Internet Governance, and we are so happy to share it with you today. You can find a link to that report in the chat. We have also invited J. Bob Alata, VP of Global Programs at Mozilla Foundation, to offer a response to Niels's work before they engage in conversation with each other. Bob has extensive experience in what it means to build, lead, and support movements for social justice. Bob also deeply understands the challenges and opportunities of integrating a technology and internet lens into movement building. She navigated this incredibly effectively through her time as executive director for the Australia Lesbian Foundation for Justice, showing that a movement for more just internet and technology policy must be intertwined with LGBTQ+ movements, feminist movements, and movements centering the liberation of people of color globally, just as it is intertwined with so many of the movements we here today are a part of or allied with. Niels and Bob are building a bridge. On one side is the complex but important world of internet governance. On the other side is the equally complex and important space of movement building for a more just society. Though they hadn't met before just a few weeks ago, Niels and Bob had been building a bridge towards each other. It's my hope that our conversation today will allow more of us to begin crossing that bridge as we work together towards a more just internet and, thus, a more just society. With that, I'd like to welcome Niels.
Thank you so much, Michael, for those kind words, and thank you everyone for being here. I am Niels ten Oever, and I am a postdoctoral researcher with the Insight IT project at the University of Amsterdam and an associated scholar with the Centro de Tecnologia e Sociedade at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas in Brazil. However, I grew up in a small town in the Netherlands, and on the weekends, we would visit my grandfather who lived on a farm. To get there, you would need to drive to the middle of nowhere, continue for about 20 minutes, take a left, and then you would reach the farm. There was very little to do there for a kid, but there was always one object that drew me to it. And that was this old tube radio. The tubes would light up green if I turned the dial and got reception. Through this shortwave radio, I would hear Russian, Arabic, Chinese, opera, jazz, and all of a sudden not feel so isolated, so far away from everything. I realized the world was filled with stories, voices, and sounds, but that one needed to be able to tune into the right frequency to receive them. It would take roughly 15 more years until I read Bertolt Brecht's lecture on radio, where he said that for the full potential of radio to be fulfilled, the listener should be able to talk back. And this is what this report is about: the ability of internet users to be able to talk back and take part in the shaping of what the internet looks like. And this is what has shaped my activism and work. the ability to build an equitable world where everyone has an equal say in how it is being shaped. The internet is often described as a global network of networks. But if this network is truly global, why is it nearly impossible to have an email address, one of the oldest applications on the internet, in a non-Latin script like Chinese, Arabic, or Hindi? Why is this not accessible? And this is not just true for applications, but also for the protocols and the whole programming stack that underpin the applications that are built on top. When Ramzi Nasser, a Lebanese-American computer scientist, wrote an Arabic programming language, he called it engineering performance art, because it functioned to show how every layer of the technological stack rejected Arabic as an acceptable form of input. There are many inherent biases, norms, and values inscribed in the internet infrastructure. Values, norms, and biases that shape everything that gets built on top of this infrastructure, which practically means all the societies we live in, that all become increasingly digitized and get influenced by the biases that are inscribed in the infrastructure. Professor Keller Easterling teaches us that infrastructures set the invisible rules for everyday life, and that the shaping of these infrastructures themselves is a form of extra statecraft. Previous transnational communication networks were largely regulated by states and intergovernmental bodies, such as the oldest still functioning international organization, the International Telecommunication Union, established in 1865. This, however, is not the case with the internet, which is governed through a myriad of multi-stakeholder bodies that are dominated by the companies that run, own, and provide the infrastructure. But this was not always the case. We should not forget that the history of the internet starts with nation states. If I would need to pinpoint the history of the internet, I would start in October 1957 with the launch of the Sputnik satellite by the Soviet Union amid the Cold War. The first human-launched artificial satellite emanated what Time magazine would call those chilling beeps that could be received all across the world. Beep, 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 that epitomized the unexpected scientific and technological supremacy of the Soviet Union over the rest of the world. This led to the establishment of the United States Department of Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, also known as ARPA, which would fund what later would become the internet. Until the early 90s, the United States government would operate the backbone of the internet, which actually prohibited the sending and receiving of traffic with commercial content, because the backbone was publicly funded through the National Science Foundation. When the Soviet Union collapsed and the United States government relinquished direct control over the internet and started a process of privatization and commercialization, which led to the formal establishment of the internet governance bodies we know today, such as the Internet Engineering Task Force, which sets the protocols and safety standards for the internet. Previously and informally, these were working groups led by the US government. Now, power and control transitioned from US governmental power to predominantly US corporate power. This power is exercised in ownership and control over the internet infrastructure, but even though there is an increasing amount of consolidation, meaning that larger parts of the infrastructure are in the hands of a smaller number of corporations, there is still a need for these corporations to collaborate, because none of them, nor should have, an absolute monopoly. These collaborations take shape through governance bodies, and in these governance bodies, non-binding rules are negotiated that allow for browsers, operating systems, routers, networks, and applications from different vendors and providers to interoperate with each other. This is in the interest of all participating parties, because the more networks and devices are connected to the internet, the more value the whole internet has. This is called network externality or network effect. And this is exactly what has helped the internet to grow to the network it is now. Everyone wants to connect to it, and with every device or service that gets connected, the incentive to connect to the internet increases. In this sense, the internet is a miracle of transnational collaboration, and the internet infrastructure consists of more than 70,000 interconnected networks, many different devices, routers, standards, institutions, and the people that keep it running. However, the governance mechanisms for the internet infrastructure are optimized to increase interconnection between all these devices and networks. This means that norms and values that might decrease interconnection get resisted or subverted. Concretely, this means that the infrastructure on which we build our information societies is designed and shaped based on the interests of multinational corporations, not on the public interest. And the governance institutions in which the internet is designed, standardized, and governed are not structurally taking the public interest into account in their processes. Actually, they resist any proposal to structurally integrate this in their processes. And this needs to change. With the increasing importance of the internet, the technologies, organizations, and institutions that run the internet should be scrutinized based on their societal impact, their impact on human rights, and on users around the world. And this is not an easy thing to ask, especially since the design of the internet is distributed and designed, standardized, and operated by many organizations. But this is by no means impossible either, and everyone should do their part. Human rights impact assessments should be an inherent part of the internet infrastructure providers' operations. And if companies are not willing to do so themselves, governance should stimulate them to do so. We already see an increase in regulations and laws by governments in Russia, China, Brazil, Germany, France, the Netherlands, as well as in the United States. Exactly because companies are not taking their responsibility to explicitly align their technologies and services with societal values. Those who design, standardize, and maintain the infrastructures on which we run our information societies should assess their actions, processes, and technologies on societal impact. Governments and civil society should participate in these processes and hold these actors to account, because the internet is simply too important. And finally, this is not an argument for internet regulation and against multi-stakeholder internet governance. Quite the opposite. This is an argument to improve internet governance, to make it more than industry self-regulation. If we want iterative, open governance processes to succeed, we should make them more democratic, which means accounting for inherent power imbalances, such as they exist now in internet governance. In order to do this, the rights and impact on citizens and society should be central in the design, standardization, and operation of networking technologies. This means that users of the internet should be understood as citizens and not just reduced to an identity of customers or entities of data extraction, but individuals and communities that have the right to know and influence how their information is being processed. There has been a time when the internet was mainly a project for the military, a time in which it was a project for academics. Then came a time in which the internet was a project for corporations. Now is the time we make the internet a project for citizens and communities. When a kid anywhere around the world logs onto the internet, they should be able to feel what I felt when I sat in the green glow of the tube radio, a sense of true connection. And this should be a connection that speaks their language, is welcoming to their identity, and is protecting their private information. An internet they can shape, and a light in which they can grow, experiment, and live. That is a human rights respecting internet infrastructure. That internet infrastructure should address them in their language and be configurable by exact that kit to their interest and identity, to allow them to further develop equitable technology for an equitable society.
Thank you so much, Niels, for that overview of your work. I'd like to invite Bob from Mozilla here now to introduce herself, offer some thoughts, and chat between you two. I'll be back in a little bit to facilitate a Q&A. So just a note for everyone here today that you can use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your questions throughout this, and we'll come back to those questions in about 20 to 30 minutes.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Niels. Niels, I could listen to you for a really long time, so I'm really glad that we get to have a conversation together. Maybe I'll just introduce myself a little bit more on the back end of Michael's introduction, and thank you for that. I'll start with this, that I really consider myself to be a movement strategist, my time at Mozilla is really looking at bringing our movement building strategy to bear globally. I really appreciated your story about your radio as well as your props. And while I don't have any props to offer, it did make me think about how I came to this work and from an earlier place than maybe my bio would suggest. Prior to joining Astrea, my entire career has been in film, and most of my work centers around diaspora and exile and the temporality of identity in relation to geography and nation states. When I found myself in the position of becoming I joke, gay for pay or an activist full time, but what it meant for me to join Astrea, but specifically what it meant to join an activist philanthropic organization, to me was about the de-invisibilization of power as it's related to capital. And Niels, when you speak about the invisibility of infrastructure, that makes me sort of sit up straight, because to me then I understand any invisibility is a power proposition, right? So the root cause of inequity, the root cause of how anything functions in the racialized capitalist global environment that we're operating in, like, to me, I understand that there's an inherent power dynamic that's at play always. And I began very specifically, if I was looking at from a human rights lens, where how people's lived experience were actually taking shape in a day-to-day. I also understand that there's a tenuous relationship between the law and our lived experience. And so when I eventually, I came to think about technology as terrain, and the internet, if in those bracketed terms, as a geography where all of the people who I care about and all the communities who I have been fighting for also exist and live. And that deeply understanding that the inequities that we face and also the opportunities that we have also exist in this geography. And so eventually the distance that it might seem between analog struggles for human rights and technological struggles for human rights, that was, I understand that as a false distance. And so that's sort of how I think we kind of find ourselves in this Zoom square today, as having conversations kind of coming from our respective perspectives. So I also learned in all of our pre-conversations that you and I could rabbit hole really easily, and I really appreciate that. So what I thought would be useful for an audience was actually to ask you to start the conversation with where you'd like this conversation to end. So what do you think the opportunity really is? Where do you want us to have this conversation, and what do you want to leave us with? And then let's spend the rest of the conversation kind of figuring out how to get there and what's caused those opportunities. So that's kind of my first question to you, Niels. And we didn't prepare these in advance because we both decided that we would be better impromptu. So you're seeing this is a real reality show for everyone who's logged into this conversation. But, and feel free, if I don't ask you something that I should, or if you think my questions are terrible, to just reframe them. I'm very happy for that.
No, this is, thanks so much, Bob. This is exactly the kind of question and the dialogue I'm hoping to have. And I was touched by two things you said. And one thing was how you grew within movements and see
Mhm.
yourself as a movement builder. And that is where I need to start, and that's also where I want to end, because my work is not done by me. I've been doing that with a lot of people, with a lot of great thinkers, a lot of great doers, and a lot of great people who have helped think and are working this out along the way. And those are people at the Regos Digitales, at the American Civil Liberties Union, at the Center for Democracy and Technology, the people at Article 19, and people around the world who have been working on these very hard issues. And the cool thing is that we don't have the answer, but no one has. So everyone who says we know how this works is just lying. So that's also the really nice thing about technologies. I do not believe that we can inscribe values in technologies per se, because they can be used in different ways in different contexts. But they can be, you can make it easier to do some things with technology than to do other things. And I think that is what we really should try to do. And by there, get as many as possible inclusive voices and different perspectives in accountable fora to produce that infrastructure for information society. And currently, that is not the case. And that is not because the people who are in power are bad. No, often they weren't even looking for those positions. They were just engineers working on networks. But they have gained a lot of influence, and sometimes they seem to have believed they deserved it. And no one does. And that is the danger, of course, of power when it centralizes, right? And that's where we should keep asking questions, build in new mechanisms, and keep on asking, can we do this differently? Is this really helping the people who need it most? Or is this actually amassing more power in smaller places, or to the people who actually don't need it at all?
I mean, when we talk about power and wealth, they become inextricable when we're talking about technology companies, right? And then when you're talking about infrastructure, I can think of that as a really like theoretical term, or as I delve into your paper, understand it as a very specific layered location and set of rules and agreements. In reading your paper, I also see that you're saying that there are some key opportunities and ways that folks can plug in. And let me kind of step back. Do you think you could there's so many acronyms and there are so many different governing bodies, et cetera, et cetera. Can you just kind of explain the difference between the rules that nations or nation states might be imposing, and then what internet governing bodies you're actually talking about? And then and then full stop. And then, because what I want to know is, if you're saying, okay, I'm a member of civil society, I'm an activist with a particular point of view, and that there's a way for me to get engaged, I don't necessarily know with whom or how, and I have limited time and attention. So that's kind of where I'm headed, is to imagine what door you think is an opportunity to walk through.
Excellent. So please allow me to go back and show you another prop. And because I think where we are now is not a new time, is not something that has never happened before. Because in the time of the telegraph, and this is a telegraph ticker.
This is amazing, by the way. I'm very impressed by your arsenal of props. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, that's my house now. So, there were the way that the telegraph was organized and regulated was very different in the US and in Europe. Mm-hmm. So in the US, it was the Bell Company that had the monopoly, and that would grow into Western Union, and had the monopoly, and there were several other smaller companies. In Europe, the telegraph was regulated by nation states, and that then went on to establish the International Telecommunications Union, Telegraph Union, which later became the International Telecommunications Union. But standardization was needed because this first transatlantic network was laid when there was a cable laid between Europe and Newfoundland. And this cable worked exactly for 3 weeks because there were no proper standards on insulation. So this 10,000, this extremely expensive project failed. And like this need for governance and standardization is often a history of failure that we need to get through to make it better. So we are now actually in a better position because we do not necessarily need to choose between governments that make laws and make binding rules, or a market that is coordinating among itself, because we currently see that the internet is being regulated by laws. That is something that corporations and individuals really need to hold themselves onto, and voluntary standards that are developed largely through internet governance. And so together they form this web of governance, but most governance of the internet still takes place in these multi-stakeholder governance bodies. And there we have a real opportunity to shape what the next generation networks look like. But it is hard for a single actor or even a larger group of civil society actors to really influence, because these agreements are non-binding and other groups are over-resourced, are actually resourced in a great disbalance to civil society actors. And even governments face that problem, that they do not have as many resources to participate. And this means that the main norm setters in multi-stakeholder internet governance are private corporations. And this is simply a function of the way multi-stakeholder governance work. And this is not because the private corporations are bad. Actually, it is great that so many people can participate in internet governance. And in many ways, it is easier to participate in internet governance than to participate in rulemaking in the UN, where individuals do not even have a say and often cannot even enter the room. In internet governance, it's very easy to join a call, to join mailing lists, to get to understand how the internet really works, because the internet is built on open standards, and that's something that's very strong. But then how do we balance the opinions of different people that participate and ensure that there is an enabling culture for different people with different shoes to participate? Because also, as excellent work of Corinne Katz shows, is that there is really a culture that is not necessarily welcoming for everyone to participate in that process, and not everyone's voice is equally valued.
I really appreciate that. Can you tell me kind of specifically about an open standard that matters in this case? If I'm looking at this with new eyes, or I don't have the breadth of your knowledge on this, that would be super helpful.
Yeah. So one that I think was civil society was very successful in stopping was a proposal by the organization VeriSign that wanted to implement a standard to comply with a Chinese draft law, a law that wasn't even gotten into effect yet, but that would create a protocol that would allow for a verified identity provider to check your identity before you would be able to register a homepage, a domain. And here you saw that a American corporation was making it easier to hamper people's freedom of expression and right to association under a particular top-level domain on the internet by giving direct insight into a verified identity provider. Mm-hmm. So civil society was able to intervene there and said, this is disproportionate, there is no clear need for this, this should not happen. So civil society has very concrete influence and successes, and this was in the Internet Engineering Task Force. There are also other things that maybe are a bit more complex, such as everyone will know the HTTP error code 404 when they mistyped a URL in their browser. Well, there is also an HTTP error code called 451 which has blocked for legal reasons. And in that case, you know when a website is blocked because a court has ordered it to be taken down. So there was really quite some work in the IETF to get this error code in there to make censorship more visible and to also allow people for redress. So if they would visit a website, they would know, someone has taken it offline, on whose authority can I complain and be informed about it? So you know why and how it's censored for and who you can seek redress with. Unfortunately, we now largely see the implementation of HTTP error code 451, not in those cases, but actually in cases where largely American media outlets do not want to comply with the General Data Protection Regulation of Europe and then just block all European IP addresses because say, we're not going to comply, so we're not going to serve you this information. So there you also see one cannot determine beforehand how something is going to work out. But meaning that you do not know how it's going to work out doesn't mean you should not consider it. So we shouldn't really not fall into the trap of technological determinism, that we can say how technology is going to be used, but we can definitely think and try to ensure that it will not be abused and it will not hamper human rights and rather create an enabling environment.
Do you imagine that in order to adopt a human rights framework or human rights impact assessment, that the way for that to happen is through a broader participation in the governance arena? Or how do you imagine that coming to fruition? And I don't assume it's one. I mean, let me name my own bias, is that in order for any change to happen, there has to be a grassroots to grass tops approach. So I don't think it's only through one mechanism, but I'm curious. I mean, obviously, you go to great length to illustrate how much of the internet governance organizations kind of were created with this utopian ideal and still exist kind of clinging to that ideal, but also preserving a monolith. And I wondered if you could unpack that a little bit.
Yeah, so I think it is human rights impact assessments are a very useful tool because it also helps us to overcome internet exceptionalism. And the UN guiding principles stem out, of course, the development of human rights after the Second World War, and the development of different treaties. And then in the 70s, there was this clear business accountability movement that started growing that said it's not just states that should be held to account, but also businesses. And this then developed into the UN Global Compact, which gave rise to the term corporate social responsibility, which often meant here I can do something wrong, but there I build a school, so we're fine. So to create more stringent and better rules for that, John Ruggie developed the UN Guiding Principles for Business and Human Rights, and that is actually being implemented in the garment sector, the extractive sector, the financial sector, and the internet, the digital infrastructure is completely lagging behind. So whereas the digital industry often prides itself on being the first, being innovative, they're actually very innovative in evading taxation and accountability. And I think this is one of the ways to use a global framework to hold them to account for social justice. And what is so smart and so nice about these human rights impact assessments is that they also say a human rights impact is never an endpoint. It's there to know and to show the impact and potential impacts on human rights and seek how to improve them. And a human rights impact assessment, an inherent part of it is always a consultation of the potentially impacted stakeholders. And that means that it's not just a corporation can do it by themselves, but they have to meaningfully engage, and the keyword here being meaningful, engage with potentially impacted communities. And this should not be an exercise that is done in the end by lawyers, but it should be an inherent part of the design. And I do think that by that way, we can create better services and create more value propositions, and that it actually helps these corporations. But it will be a work to integrate that into the awareness of these different professionals who also may have a hard time working with groups that have different vocabularies and different expertises and different perspectives, but they will be the end users. So having them, or at least those impacted by it, so having them influencing the design process can actually help, and also help ensure that nothing bad happens down the road.
Yeah. I really, when you were talking about the Bell system, in the early days of the telegraph and then the telephone in the US, I was grateful that you said that, because I'd actually scribbled that in my notes in a draft of of your paper. Because if you look when and the difference that of other countries that weren't laden with that particular infrastructure, there was able to be innovation in countries that weren't beholden to landline infrastructure the way the US was. And if you look at mobile adoption, the US actually was a decade behind in many ways. And the innovation that you're talking about now in terms of human rights adoption, I think that lagging behind is not divorced from the fact that it's North American multinationals who often are the drivers behind a lot of the infrastructure adoption here. It's just simply not unrelated. It relates to their bottom line. And if you look at just even the wealth that's been accumulated just during the pandemic, that okay, I'm legitimately about to make an argument that's based on a meme, but since the meme lives on the internet, I feel like it's a meta enough moment that I can lean into that. So it was a meme about billionaires that I just saw, but ostensibly the bottom line is that in order for there to be billionaires, and there's the requirement of the conditions that create poverty, right? And in fact, we know this. But that symbiotic relationship necessitates a lack of representation. It necessitates human rights abuse. It necessitates all of those things. And so to actually create a standard by which there's some assessment, and that the human rights are actually factored in to governance structure. I mean, if I'm following your argument, at some point, there also has to be a less of a consolidation of power. And that feels compelling to me. Like that actually, I definitely highlighted lines in the report really because of that. And I want to sort of say some things that are happening on the other side of the aisle in folks who in human rights defense, right? So that there exists, whether it's the Commission on the Status of Women, whether it's the Inter-American Council, or even most recently in the Generation Equality Forum, which is the 2020-2021 version of the Beijing meeting, that the freedom for women human rights defenders, for example, they included calls to corporations who own social media platforms. So demands are being made by folks who in the technosphere, if you will, by human rights defenders. And I think to your point, like if there can be more meeting grounds and actually, and I'm trying to get us to some of your recommendations here of like of taking us to the tour even of if folks who are already doing work around human rights defense, around different justice modalities, and where they're looking at multilateral engagement, whether we're funders or we're civil society actors, what internet governing bodies should we put on those tours, just like we do show up to comment and make demand at the UN, at the Inter-American Council, in all these other arenas. So one, where should we show up, and where can our voices be heard in a way that would be meaningful, and we can start building a culture of expectation around human rights adoption and care.
Yeah, thanks so much for that. So it's not for nothing that the imaginary or the metaphor of the internet changed from an electronic superhighway to a cloud. Because a lot of these corporations thought there are actually a bit too many rules for roads. And a cloud is actually not owned, and it's just it evaporates, right? And this is an argument made by Julie Cohen in Between Truth and Power, that where she shows how law has actually been almost complicit in creating this unregulated environment. And we should not think we can fix the internet in one place, just as we can never fix anything in one place. The internet is a very complex infrastructure consisting of institutions, people, expertise, cultures, and then some technologies. You know, it happens in between law, architectures, market, and public values. So where I think the undoing of the optimization of the infrastructure happens is within civil society communities and within our own communities, where we imagine the infrastructures that we need, where we think, what is the real IoT, the Internet of Things, or what is the real smart city that I want? Is it really the 8K TV, or is that a functionality that I need to be closer my family and friends with? And who do I want as intermediaries for that? And who do I think I feel I can hold to account? And how do we inscribe those values? So instead of only being reactive, we can also make demands, because this is our infrastructure and we have chosen to build our societies on it, and therefore it becomes public infrastructure. And this doesn't mean it needs to be completely run by government, but it means we need to make agreements on what is allowed and what is not. And there we still have a lot to imagine, and we can imagine that because technology is changing so fast. And it was so interesting, the argument you made, you know, because GSM, so mobile, the largest innovations in mobile networks were made in Europe, which led to the invention of GSM, and that beat the CDMA standard. And then the internet has a very strong birth history in the United States, but now 5G is largely being developed in Asia. But still, this means new norms are inscribed and then can be appropriated and be reconfigured. And that is also for us to ask questions to that invisible infrastructure. And that is where the process of accountability and shaping the infrastructure starts. And there it's where it starts to become a real conversation. And right now, I almost feel that in many cases, even though infrastructure with the infrastructure bill and with the content distribution networks and a lot of these services going down, we now see that we've become dependent on this infrastructure, and a lot of these actors that no one actually heard of, that hide behind acronyms that we'd never even thought of, you know. And this is almost what internet governance is. It's almost a Scrabble board that has fallen over. And in one way, that shows in group and out group, who is in the know, who has the expertise, who knows who. But it's also almost a trade language to allow engineers, diplomats, civil society actors, and people from all around the world to work together on such a complex network that has never been built on such a scale, right? So that is tough. So we can also demand that to be different, because it can always be thought different. And that's something we should not be afraid of, to really think the internet and think the governance of communication networks differently. And often we hear now, well, this is the best way it's done because it has never been done in other ways. And this has also been one of the arguments why the discussion in the Internet Engineering Task Force was so hefty on a relatively simple ask to not use the language of master-slave anymore. And this was a very hefty discussion, also talk about blacklists and whitelists. And the engineer said, these are technical things. We never meant anything bad. So you're calling us racist. So you cannot do this. And it's like, we can just change it and then it would be over with. And that discussion was not solved until the US Standards Institute made a formal statement on it. And then they said they were happy to listen to it, right? So it is really hard to change these norms and to address them and to bring in people with other expertise that help us think that further.
So, I mean, it's a little chicken and eggish, like, does the culture demand standards shift? Do the standards beget the culture that we're living in? And we have only a few minutes left before we go to Q&A. So I just want to, I'm thinking about your recommendations, whether it's for civil society, whether it's for governments, and whether it's for internet governance orgs. Are there any key recommendations that you'd like to bring forward so we're holding them as a group?
Yeah, I think all actors should engage in these human rights impact assessments because they create a platform to not just have that conversation in these bodies, but also with stakeholders outside of these bodies. And that is a crucial platform that I think we should hold. And that is also a strong platform on which future accountability mechanisms can be built. So that is true for governments, civil society, corporations, and we see progress there. Cloudflare has just announced their human rights policy. Ericsson has done their first human rights impact assessment of 5G. So the industry is waking up to it, and governments have now started to regulate because everyone knows something is going to change, and we should be there to help them make the right change.
And you see that as a tipping point? You see that as a place for us to kind of shift the tide by our presence?
Definitely, I think there's definitely a strong opportunity, but here again, we also build on the people that have always been there, made that space, but now we definitely see that there is momentum. So there is definitely so political opportunity theory describes it as being a surfer in the sea and seeing the right wave at the right moment. But just coming back from a surfing vacation myself, you also know when to need to get up. And I think this is the time we should really get up and ride that wave.
Right on. Okay. There's been a very live conversation in the chat, so I'm sure Michael wants to usher us through Q&A.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I was smiling at that whole conversation. It's so exciting to hear you both talk to each other, and so thank you both for taking this time. There are a lot of questions already in the Q&A. I'm going to do my best to parse through them. I've picked out some so far. Just a reminder to everyone here, we have like 15-20 minutes for Q&A, something like that, and you can jump into the kind of Q&A button on Zoom and ask your questions. You can also vote up questions that you're particularly interested in, and that will help me in getting through them. So I want to start here by taking a question from Jed Miller, then offering my own kind of editorial addition to it, which Jed asks, what are the different levers that can bring a human rights perspective into the hearts and practices of internet governance organizations and the tech companies that govern them? The kind of modification I want to give to that is, I think, Niels, you might be able to speak to a bit some of how civil society work is already structured to kind of do those levers. I don't know if you want to mention the PITG group or other kind of ways civil society organizations have gotten engaged to kind of find and pull these levers.
Yeah, there are excellent groupings of civil society organizations. For instance, in the Internet Engineering Task Force, that is called the Public Interest Technology Group, where a lot of great organizations, individuals, and tech activists participate and offer up their knowledge, have regular calls to help you on board, and then also divide the work because so much is going on at the same time. There is also very active civil society in the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, but there is much less so in the Institute for Electric and Electronical Engineers, when you look at the standardization side. So there is a lot of different things to do, but where there are opportunities, there are also other organizations that can help you get done that. And here I again would like to call out the excellent work of Article 19, the Regos Digitales, the Association for Progressive Communications, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the Center for Democracy and Technology. And these are organizations that have been there and that are trying to bring in these visions with some successes to celebrate.
Thanks, Niels. By the way, thank you everyone for jumping in the Q&A and bumping questions up and down. The next question I want to ask a question from Florentina Tudos. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. And I'm curious on both of your perspectives on this. Florentina asks, how do we avoid human rights standards from being replaced with vague ethical standards that sound great, but do not actually hold individuals or organizations accountable? I'd imagine you both have perspectives on this in general, even if not in the specific internet governance space.
Thank you so much. I am with you. So the whole AI ethics debate has been much more about legitimizing a practice and a frame instead of increasing accountability. And I would be the first one to say that human rights are not perfect, but it's definitely the best global norm that we have at the moment that is allowing for global conversations. Because 194 countries around the world have signed up to it. We have these models for accountability. Let's build on them. And even like with new crisis, human rights legislation is adaptable. For instance, in the Netherlands, human rights legislation was used to force Shell to increase its investments into green energy because of the environmental impact would have a negative impact on the human rights of future generations. So here we see also even the evolution of these human rights frameworks, not only for business accountability, but also to our current climate crisis. So I think that's very important. And yeah.
I actually want to unpack it, and just bear with me, Michael, you can laugh at me a little bit, but of like why there would be a shift towards ethics versus human rights. And I would say that because that allows us to divorce standards from the body. And so actually, if you look at the people who suffered the abuse and do not who suffer human rights abuse, it's the same people that from whom data is extracted, and that actually, if we can keep things in vague terms around ethics, we can continue the same business model that leads to the abuse in the first place. And so the tension and the desire to have things be in this vague ethics frame versus a human rights frame is the tension between having to acknowledge the bodies in the room in the first place. And so that's actually, it doesn't answer your question, except it speaks to why the condition exists for the question in the first place. And I think that that's why there has to be this kind of a marriage between our work. It's actually why I'm working at Mozilla now at all, but I think that it's a really important question, and I think we can't become untethered from that truth if we're actually want to see change happen.
Thank you, Robin. My smiles are not because I'm laughing, but because I'm so happy, because this is why I was so happy to have you be part of this conversation. And thank you too, Niels. I think you all are really offering very complementary and intertwined perspectives. I think we have a lot of academics on the line, which is why this one got voted up a bunch. So I'm going to ask the second half of this question from Laura James, which is, should we be developing partnerships between computer science academics and civil society experts particularly academics, those few that are in the IETF, ITU spaces who are not working for big tech. So how do we think about academic computer science or engineering disciplines and engagement in this space?
That's an excellent question. And I think that is something that the Public Interest Technology Group actively tries to do. And in part, that is who I am. I'm an academic who tries to be connected to these, but we also all know as academics that participating in standards and governance organizations already is not really rewarded towards tenure and on the career track, where it's pretty much publish or perish. And for instance, I would not be able to cite the report I wrote here for tenure track. So let alone then not contributing critically contributing to governance bodies. How could that? So I think we definitely should, because academics still have time to think about these complex issues and have at least part of the independence to do so. The question is how to create the right incentive structures for them to do so. And that is still a question that looms large. And there have been progress made in science and technology studies and GigaNet, but I think we still have a long way to come to also break out of our own academic discussions and make it really applicable and really connect and listen to the needs and the wants of civil society and end users. I hope that wasn't too rambling.
One thing I would add is we have an initiative called the Responsible Computer Science Challenge, where we're funding computer science programs, undergraduate programs in the US, and now we're expanding that work globally to engage in interdisciplinary work. And I think, and we're entering phase 2 of that work, but it also it really ties to me, like the motivation behind it is really similar to the infrastructure conversation, is that it's a rare opportunity to get to root cause. And I think that I really appreciate what you were saying about academic incentive structures, because I think that that's something that there's like this presumption of altruism for the few academics who want to be interdisciplinary. And that's just rubbish, right? Like there's a great desire for that, and that structurally it's not rewarded. And I think that particularly those of us who kind of straddle philanthropy and activism, civil society, and or technology or tech companies, I think that that's an important thing for us to take up, is to try to offset that the dearth of incentive for that work, because there's a great appetite for it. So I appreciate that question a lot.
Yeah, thank you both. And go ahead, Niels.
If I could shortly add on to that, and there are a few things I forgot. So I think there is already cross-pollination happening also. If you see excellent organizations such as Ranking Digital Rights that have really adapted a scientific methodology to ranking, which is so beautiful to see, and also turning that back to investors. So really connecting architecture, market, and academia, that's beautiful to see. The Article 19 has the Internet of Rights Fellowship program that allows people to pay for travel. And I think the Public Interest Technology Group also helps academics to participate in meetings and then enables them to do so. It's not full, and there are excellent academics working on this. So I just wanted to acknowledge that.
And I'll just note that as an academic myself, that a lot of the kind of power structures and the kind of, we do things this way because that's the way things have always been, that we're talking about intergovernance bodies, of course, like has had a long history of that in academia. And to your point, Niels, of, this wonderful report you wrote wouldn't count towards tenure, I think is a great example of that. I think anyone on this call that's, submitted a paper to a conference realizing that the gatekeepers are probably folks that have been in the field for decades, and they're deciding whether your paper is going to get through. So it's based a lot on what they think is right for computer science or whatever academic discipline, rather than what's changing at the moment. I want to bring up this question from Agustina Del Campo, who asks about the use of the language you've been using specifically, Neil, is about citizens as opposed to users. How do you think about that? What brings you to that language of citizen? And just noting that Augustina says, this is something that I kind of struggle with in my own thinking about human rights on and offline and state and corporate responsibility vis-a-vis the people under their jurisdiction. So talk a bit about that language.
Yeah, thanks so much. That is a really good question. So there is, of course, a very big problem with the language of citizenship, and with a big problem within human rights, namely the case of people who are stateless. And Hannah Arendt wrote extensively about this, and this is a well-known criticism against human rights, that even though under international law, statelessness is forbidden, it still happens, and then it leaves people who actually need protection most outside of protection, and this is definitely something to need to be addressed. So I indeed wanted to contrast user with citizen, to take it out, to take the end user and the user out of the frame of consumerism and into the frame of a human being, and within clear accountability structures. Having said that, human might be better, but then that also leaves hard places on where to get the jurisdiction and the rights and responsibilities. So in here, I think we also need to be careful to not fall into the trap of, should it be industry self-regulation or should it be governmental regulation? Because in almost all fields, it is hybrid and it is iterative. So there is no either or, nothing is fully governmentally regulated. And we should need to be brave enough to think of ways in which we can combine it to create the outcome that we want, and that the outcome that everyone needs and deserves. And of course, this is very complex also in case of international norm development, where Europe is often seen as norm entrepreneur, but sometimes also other parts of the world are seen as norm experimentation grounds, which are very problematic, right? So that is why we need strong communities to be able to call that out, but also create imaginaries for the infrastructures that we want, deserve, and should be able to demand. And that we should then also, through international solidarity, call out these companies about. Because if you look at the topology of the internet, you see that the interconnection, that if you look at the topography, everything is more getting strongly interconnected. But if you look at the topology of the data streams, then you see, for instance, that almost all data traffic out of Africa is still going through former colonizer countries. And these are still extractive relationships that should be broken, that should be under, that should not be there. And the same with the language issue that I brought up earlier, is that these power structures and structures of exclusion are reproduced over the years, and new technologies do not change that. Rather, they often embed it even deeper and in new ways. And that's why a strong decolonization and a real critical review of technologies and keeping power in check is so important.
Thank you, Niels. We have time, I think, for a couple. I'm going to make a note of a quick question, and then I'll bring up one more question that I think both of you will have thoughts on. If we have time to get another, we'll do it, or otherwise we'll move on from there. So the quick question, just to note, is there's a lot of interest in a reading list of all the book props you've been showing today, Niels. So I think one thing that we're going to ask you to do after this call is just to write a little reading list. And I think when we send out our post-event summary to everyone here, we'll make sure to include that reading list. And Bob, if you would like to include some reading materials in that, I know you weren't ready with props like Niels was, feel free to throw in some as well. The question I want to go to is a version of the one asked by Elisa Lindinger. Lisa asks, are today's internet governance bodies even the space in which we can bring a human rights perspective? What needs to change on their end to make the topic being considered, discussed, and implemented more willingly? So I think this, I'm curious about this answer, both in regards to the internet standards bodies, like you're thinking about, Niels. I'm also curious, Bob, on your perspective of of your experiences, of what it means to bring human rights and justice frames to new spaces and try and get those spaces to take it seriously. So I suspect both of you, feel free to riff on that however you see fit.
Bob, you want to start?
Not really, but I mean, it's interesting. I come to it with so much suspicion, honestly, right? Like I didn't, you know, I feel like I weirdly got plopped into rooms with like multilateral rooms with all of these governments, and suddenly was this like abolitionist who had to suddenly make the case, right? And I think. So I think the question is the right one. Is this even the right room? And I think where I've come to now is kind of what I was intimating earlier, that it has to be an all hands on deck proposition. And so since there's not only one way for this to happen, I do think that there's a way that, like, insofar as we have whomever has access to development agendas, we should be putting this framework, marrying internet freedom or internet governance and human rights inside of traditionally human rights frameworks, so that bring in the internet as a location and either for where these human rights need to be accounted for, and or harm needs to be mitigated or opportunity needs to be instigated. And that can happen through a lot of different multilateral development agendas. It can happen at the grassroots level when people are calling for policy change or even abolition altogether. There are many, many nuanced conversations that are happening inside of multiple grassroots movements, whether it's for Black liberation in the United States or feminist liberation globally, or diasporic migrant justice work or climate justice work. Like, if we can have a call for that in a symbiotic way. And then I also think at the state level, I actually literally mean the state level in terms of the United States, looking at commerce, and then at the state level, at the national and federal levels globally, if we can look at where people are most affected, whether it's inside of commerce or agriculture or privacy laws or free speech or fair trade agreements, it's where there are these unlikely locations, one would think, for human rights abuse or human rights consideration, but often it's in those arenas. And so I think if we can infiltrate as many places as possible from our various points of view, the likelihood of an internet governance organization actually shifting becomes much more great, right? We have the opportunity there for a human rights framework to be adopted if the culture surrounding it, if the capital transfer surrounding it, if the government demands or the citizen demands are making that actually likely and actually either profitable or stopping the flow of information because of there's a disparity between what the governance bodies are calling for and what the world is calling for. So I think that I see it as and I mean that as least idealistic as that sounds, but I do think it just has to be a multi-pronged approach in order for it to take shape in a way that's meaningful or everlasting.
That's great. I'll just add a little footnote to that. And this is from a chapter from Jeanette Hoffman in the Researching Internet Governance book. And she says that, and she is really a veteran of multi-stakeholder internet governance. And then in this chapter, she evaluates their experience in the history of multi-stakeholder internet governance. And then she says the actual achievements of the multi-stakeholder concept are likely to be primarily of a sense-making nature. Its credibility is based on political aspirations rather than on a proven superior regulatory efficacy. From an empirical perspective, it is striking how much effort it takes to take multi-stakeholderism work, and it is no exaggeration to say that the stakeholders take pains to adapt the reality of internet governance to meet the concept's assumptions. So in other words, We expected a lot from it and it did not deliver. But that is actually where the real work starts. So what can we, of course, it was not going to deliver on the big promise of governance, innovation, and democracy for all. But what we now need to see, when the rubber hits the road, how can we really make it work, if we can make it work? And we have to say, if we compare it to other governance bodies, there is still much easier access to archives, access to people, and people who are there are really knowledgeable. There are a lot of very knowledgeable people who know how to run networks, who know how technology can work, and also who can help us think of it differently. And in these bodies, we also can start thinking of technology differently, right? So it is also a resource. It's not something that we simply have to battle, because a lot of the smart people who can help us change and who also have an interest in change are there. So we have something to get from them, but we also have some frames to bring. So, and of course, there's always the discussion of the inside and the outside. And if you're inside, you're legitimizing. And when you're outside, you're not helping with the reform. Is it reform or revolution? Well, it's both. And then we'll leave it to the historians to say who was successful, because gambling beforehand will not get us anywhere.
Thank you, Niels. Thank you, Bob. We're going to leave it at that. It's been really wonderful having you two in conversation, and I look forward to a time where we could all be in the same place and have dinner together, and maybe some of you in the audience can join us as well for that. I just want to share a few closing thank yous before we go. So again, thank you everyone for joining. It's been really lovely just to see how many people were interested in this topic, and we're here for this. I also want to thank the really amazing Forward Events team who all put this together. There's really so much work that goes on behind the scenes for events like this. Like, there are six folks on this call today alone that you have not seen: Niluka, Adana, Brian, Elizabeth, Hajra, our translators, who are just making things go, doing timing, handling invites, putting together the production, and it really makes our job easy in terms of folks that are here talking to you to kind of just focus on what we want to talk about. So thank you all for that. And I also want to thank, of course, our comms team, and especially Vivek Trivedi, who's helped see this report through. And I guess my last ask for you all is, we would love your help in spreading the word about this report and about this work. So you have the link to the report. We'll send that out again in our follow-ups. We would like this to get in the hands of more folks, just so that in our broader conversation around creating a more just internet, we can have this strong perspective on the layers of infrastructure and how we can make them more just as well. So thank you so much. And we'll see you next time we have an event like this.